Growing up in the early 2000s was a time I like to consider the golden age of fantasy book adaptations. Film series such as The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and to an extent The Chronicles of Narnia were all widely successful and highly appreciated translations that are still, to this day, considered some of the best fantasy adaptations we've ever seen. But even with something as critically acclaimed as The Lord of the Rings, fantasy content has mostly been a niche interest, with most water cooler topics being reserved for other genres or interests. That was until 2011, when a series called Game of Thrones, adapted from the works of George R.R. Martin, came out. This dark and gritty fantasy series had done what most fantasy adaptations had failed to do. It was mainstream and socially acceptable to talk about in almost any given situation. Instead of feeling embarrassed for bringing it up, you could even make other people feel stupid that they hadn't seen it. Game of Thrones was massive, and if we go ahead and ignore the last 2 seasons, we can agree that it was the most successful mainstream fantasy series to date. However, as I mentioned, Game of Thrones did eventually come to an end, and in the wake of its departure, every streaming service on the planet was desperate to capitalize on the vacancy that had been left behind. A question soon began to form as people wondered when the next time an episodic, well-written, good quality, high fantasy TV show would emerge that would triumph all barriers and be universally accepted. What would be the next Game of Thrones? This became the driving question for many companies as they poured their resources into acquiring whatever fantasy rights they could gather and plunged headfirst into an arms race to capture the vacancy that had been left by Thrones. Over the last 5 years, we have seen many projects try and fail to capture that spark. From Amazon, we saw The Rings of Power, which was a further exploration of the world from The Lord of the Rings. Which, just for the record, I am going to admit that I personally enjoyed this series, and before any of you care to inform me that I am wrong, I would just like to state that I have read the Silmarillion 3 times, know my Middle-earth lore, and am well capable of forming my own opinions. This adaptation, which toted the largest budget from a TV show ever, was unfortunately met by infighting among the fanbase before the first episode was even out. This was a problem that didn't plague Thrones until much later on in its run, but unfortunately spells disaster for Rings of Power ever being a quote-unquote mainstream series. Amazon wasn't the only streaming service to try and win the fantasy lottery. Netflix themselves began producing a TV show called The Witcher, based upon the critically acclaimed novels and games of the same name. With a big budget, gritty, violent tone, and Henry Cavill as the lead, you'd think that maybe this one would have been a Thrones successor. But once again, the show, which had a pretty interesting twist in the first season in my opinion, was still met with disappointment. And despite Henry Cavill's every effort to fight for authenticity from the translation between the page and the screen, The Witcher failed to become a hit with dedicated fans and casuals alike. Yet another attempt from Amazon was the Wheel of Time series, and like everything mentioned before, was at least a success with the critics, but general audiences never really clicked with it. Of all the series mentioned so far, this is definitely the one that I had heard the least about, and didn't even realize it had a second season until well after it had finished airing. All in all, there are many good things about the Wheel of Time series, but it is also extremely disjointed and confusing for general audiences, which, for the purpose of being the next Game of Thrones, makes it a failure in this instance. Among all the attempts to create the next Game of Thrones, and there are more that I haven't even mentioned here, probably the closest so far is ironically The House of the Dragon, which is a prequel to Thrones. The show has only had 1 season so far, but during its run it managed to outpace Rings of Power each weekend that they were running back to back. It successfully managed to encapsulate the excitement that early seasons of Thrones were able to cultivate so effortlessly. However, with the negative reception of the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, it does seem that there are some newfound trust issues among the fan base, which only time will tell if House of the Dragon is able to alleviate. As a diehard fantasy enthusiast, these last couple years have been hard due to unmet expectations and fan base infighting. For someone who just wants to see fully realized and immersive fantasy worlds brought faithfully and compellingly to the big screen, I've really come to resent this whole industry craze with the search for the next Game of Thrones. All it's managed to do so far is expedite the process of a lot of these shows coming to the big screen, but at the expense of any sort of originality. In an effort to transform these series into the next Game of Thrones, the consequence is that they try unsuccessfully to toe the line between mainstream appeal and respecting the source material, with most adaptations foregoing the source material altogether in pursuit of the next high fantasy drama. Feels like nowadays the only place to find truly refreshing and innovative fantasy content is in the animated format, where it seems like this unbearable pressure to make everything mainstream is at least not as oppressive. I've seen many incredible animated fantasy shows over the last couple of years, and while I think that it should be respected more as a medium and might honestly be my preferred form of television, there is still an innate desire to see fantasy shows reach the heights of projects from the early 2000s. In my opinion, I think the entire next Game of Thrones obsession has done more harm than good for the fantasy genre as a whole. Many people would probably be happier if companies actually started striving to create stories inspired by the works of talented authors and sticking to those messages and themes. Real complication begins when a director decides that they want to add their own flavor to a project that already exists and is beloved, instead of understanding their responsibility as a mere translator from text to screen. Incredible original work does exist and is created every day. If directors want to make their own fantasy worlds with their own messages and themes, please do. I will happily accept all fantasy content I can get. But all in all, I think companies need to abandon this search for the next Game of Thrones and focus on creating content that emulates the source material. However, I understand the film industry doesn't work that way, and executives are never going to turn down the search for the so-called holy grail of fantasy television. So if I was in a room with them and forced to give a pitch on what I personally think the next Game of Thrones should be, then I would say without hesitation to make a live-action Elder Scrolls series. I think specifically the Skyrim region would serve as a great start and probably have the most widespread appeal. We all know that Fallout is getting its own show, so what's to stop Bethesda from translating another property into television? And if things keep going the way of Starfield, might be a good time to make that shift. The Elder Scrolls universe is incredibly packed with source material and fits into an exact aesthetic that could mimic Game of Thrones. Additionally, with the open-ended nature of the games, this allows creators to get more experimental with the source material and dive into areas we haven't seen before without a huge risk of upsetting dedicated fans. Plus, if you don't think a live-action Skyrim would be satisfying to see, just take a look at this in-game render of the town Solitude versus an artist's rendition of what a lore-accurate scale would look like. In the end, I have no power over anything that happens, and like everyone else, must consign myself to the whims of major studios, and at least be thankful that fantasy content has a large enough fan base to warrant new shows and movies each year. I've learned to be happy with the crumbs I can get, but the problem with waiting is it gives you a lot of time to think. And this is why I personally think that the idea that anything could be the next Game of Thrones, or the next Lord of the Rings, or the next Star Wars is a horrible mentality. All it does is encourage the desaturation of ideas and instead promotes the regurgitation of concepts over and over again, with each failed attempt to capture the essence of what once was a new and original idea.